Hello, friends. Thank you for tuning in. We got a great show for you this week. Before I introduce the guest, as always, please follow, subscribe, rate, and review the show. It helps boost the podcast, grow the audience, get us more exposure, and ultimately grow the podcast to the place where I think it can be and get the best guests and just keep expanding and expanding onwards and upwards, as they say. So please, that really helps the show. Additionally, go follow me on social media, ROYBTZ on Instagram and ROY_BNTZ on Twitter. You can subscribe to the newsletter, which gives you access to updates, occasional blog posts, news about guests and the future of the show. And most importantly, you can get the podcast conveniently in your inbox every week. Finally, please consider supporting this independent podcast. I made the decision not to work with sponsors on this podcast. I wanted to be completely independent. So for the price of a cup of coffee, you can support this independent podcast. And I really do appreciate that. Also, if you want to start your own podcast, I have a full tutorial that covers everything you need to know, soup to nuts, A to Z, how to start, grow, execute, market, reach out to guests, everything you want to know about starting a podcast. This has it. So I will leave a link in the show notes, make it easy for you to find. And go check it out. All right, let me introduce this week's guest, Anna Lemke. Anna is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. She is the author of the book Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. And this book is extremely popular. She's been doing the podcast route. She's been on all the best, biggest, and most popular podcasts out there. And I wanted to have her here as well because I think this is a very important conversation to have. I think addiction on a more broad level is starting to creep up into every facet of our lives through digital. And while addiction used to mean drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, maybe food, stuff like that, nowadays you see it in a much more prevalent and insidious way through our phones, through our computers, through social media. It's just controlling every facet of our lives. And that's not to be Mr. Doom and Gloom. It's not all bad, but it is something to point out. It is something to be aware of, and it is an important conversation for us to have, as this is just something that we have on us all the time. And we cover other things. It's not only social media and tech, but addiction at large. And so this is extremely fascinating podcast, very insightful, and I think it could be useful to a lot of people. So I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Here is Anna Lemke. Enjoy the episode, everyone.
The Genuinely Interested Podcast.
Anna, how are you doing this morning?
I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
I'm awesome. Thank you for joining the podcast. I've heard you on a bunch of podcasts, as I just mentioned before we started recording. And I have to say, as a guest, you're one of the most honest and open people I've ever heard speak on podcasts, which is extremely rare these days. So I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that and throw some praise your way.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the podcast. I think because I like people and I'm curious about people.
Yeah.
And I'm also honored, of course, that people are interested in my work and want to interview me. So it's been really fun.
Yeah, no, you do an amazing job. I've enjoyed all the podcasts that I've listened to. So you are the author of Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. Can you give the audience maybe a bit of background for people who may not know who you are?
Sure. I am a psychiatrist. I'm on the faculty here at the Stanford University School of Medicine. I teach, I do research, I see patients. I have been here for a long time. I came out to Stanford for medical school and I essentially never left. And that's kind of what I do. I specialize in addiction treatment. Okay. So that's my area of subspecialty, but I treat all kinds of co-occurring psychiatric disorders from psychosis to depression to anxiety disorders, you name it.
what prompted you to write the book? Is this just from, how many decades of you in the field? Is this something you've, been thinking about for a long time, or just something recent that you wanted to put out?
Yeah, so these are definitely ideas that have been percolating for a long time, especially as my practice has changed over the last 20 years. It's changed in the sense that I've had a massive shift in my philosophy around mental health treatment, but I've also seen increasing numbers of patients who are really unhappy, addicted to a variety of substances and behaviors, and yet have all the good things we could hope for in life: good parents, good friends, good jobs, clean air, relative wealth. And so I really became very curious about why is it that even when our lives are good and we have all of those things that, we do equate with sort of human thriving, why is it that so many of us are still struggling so much? And that's sort of where the ideas of Dopamine Nation kind of came into being.
Okay. So I have a lot of questions for you, but before we get into all that, maybe just we can kind of lay the groundwork and touch upon a few things, and maybe you can explain for people who may not know the exact things. So what is dopamine? I'm sure everyone's heard of dopamine, but maybe not everyone knows exactly what dopamine is. Can you explain that?
Yes, dopamine is a chemical in the brain. It's a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are molecules that bridge the gap between neurons. That gap is called the synapse. So neurons are the very long, spindly cells in our brains that conduct the electrical signals, that make the circuits, that make our emotions, thoughts, feelings, you name it. But those neurons do not touch end to end. There's a little space between them. That space is the synapse, and neurotransmitters are the molecules that bridge that gap to lend a finer sense of control to that neural circuit. Dopamine is one of many neurotransmitters. It's not the only one, but it is the most important neurotransmitter to the experience of motivation, reward, and pleasure. And it's the neurotransmitter that is intimately involved in the disease of addiction, which is a brain disease.
And what is dopamine deficit or dopamine deficit state? I don't know.
Right.
Which is the correct one?
Yeah. So dopamine deficit state. So we all have a tonic baseline level of dopamine firing. So dopamine is being released in a part of our brain called the reward pathway, which is a very old part of the brain that's been conserved across millions of years of evolution and across species. It's virtually identical across species. Mm-hmm. And dopamine is always being released in that part of the brain called the reward pathway. When we do something pleasurable, more dopamine is released. The signature feature of things that are addictive is that they release a whole lot of dopamine all at once. And so hence are very reinforcing, and we want them to do them again. And we'll often work very hard to try to get that substance or behavior that releases a lot of dopamine, because we're wired to do that. We're wired to approach pleasure and avoid pain. It's what's kept us alive in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. So the dopamine deficit state is what happens in the brain if we continually bombard the reward pathway with a lot of dopamine. Essentially, the brain has to adapt to that increased dopamine by downregulating dopamine transmission, dopamine receptors, dopamine production. And over time, it will eventually go into what we call a dopamine deficit state, which is really akin to a clinical depression. People feel anxious, depressed, irritable, can't sleep. And the lesson here is that if we continually indulge in highly reinforcing drugs or behaviors, we will eventually get into a dopamine deficit state as our brain tries to compensate for too much dopamine, and we will become depressed, unhappy, however you want to characterize that. So that's what a dopamine deficit state is.
So that we need to find some sort of a balance, right? Because I feel like I just keep hearing that everything is addicting and everything is addictive and people are addicted to everything. And it's just, if it's food, if it's coffee, if it's alcohol, if it's social media, if it's porn, we'll get into all this stuff later. But is it just about finding balance? And is it getting harder to find balance just because everything is programmed and wired to make us consume more of it, right? The food, they're engineering it for us to consume more. Social media, it's engineered for us to consume more. Everything is about making us buy more of it. So it's getting harder to find that balance.
Yes, exactly. And that's why the book is called Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. It's not about never having pleasure. That's not the message at all. But the message is that it's much harder to find balance in a world in which everything has literally become drugified. Everything has been made more accessible, more bountiful, more potent, more novel. These are all things that will release more dopamine, such that we really need to think about inviting kind of a new asceticism or restraint into our lives as a way to compensate for an environment that's absolutely flooded with these cheap pleasures.
And then the last thing, if you could define, I guess clinically, what is the definition for addiction?
Yeah. So the broadest definition for addiction is the continued compulsive use of substances or behaviors despite harm to self and or others. A shorthand for the DSM-5 criteria, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the compendium that psychiatrists and other mental health care providers use to make these diagnoses, can be briefly summarized into the 4 C's: control, compulsion, consequences, and cravings, plus tolerance, needing more and more of a drug over time to get the same effect, and dependence, experiencing withdrawal when the drug is no longer available.
I understand. Okay. You were part of the documentary, the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. And that was a sobering documentary. I know at the time, many people that saw it, they deleted their, social media accounts, including myself for a very brief period of time. And, but they all came back, at least everyone I know. I'm sure maybe some people didn't. And for me, it was interesting because even the people on the documentary who knew the hacks, the brain hacks, who knew what was happening behind the scenes, they still were on Twitter and they still were on social media and they still were on the phone. Is it just an unbreakable addiction? And like, I actually, more than the other addictions, I want to talk today a lot about social media, but yeah, like from your perspective, is it just one of those things where it's almost unbreakable?
Well, I think there are a couple of things happening in parallel here. On the one hand, social media is inherently addictive. That doesn't mean that everybody is addicted to it, but that means that those of us who are vulnerable to social media addiction will really struggle with the platform. Why is it addictive? Because it's essentially drugified human connection. We are evolved over millions of years to connect with other people. We are tribal creatures. It's what's kept us alive, protected us from predators, allowed us to find mates. And what social media has done is made those human connections, which, by the way, human connection releases dopamine. So when people like us, when they appraise us, when they have the same emotion at the same time that we're having it, all of that releases dopamine mediated by oxytocin, the love hormone. So what social media does is just like turbocharges all of that, turns it up to 11 with zero effort, right? I don't even need to get off the couch to go meet the people. So it's inherently addictive. And so that's part of the problem. But I think another really important piece of this is that so many of us now actually live our lives online that even when we try to get off and go and create a life in real life, there are no people there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, one of the things that I sort of talk about is, as a parent, when I was a kid, we all went out to the back alley. Nobody communicated with anybody else. You just knew there would be people there, right? And you would play hide and seek and kick the can and you name it, right? And now I would love to, encourage parents to send their kids to the back alley. But the truth is there will be no kids there. They will not be there, right?
Yeah. And you don't want to meet the person in the back alley that's there now.
Could be. But unless you intentionally organize it, there's no there.
Yeah.
And so it's really a kind of a vicious cycle, right? where we are now really inhabiting the virtual world in a much more invested way than we are inhabiting our real lives, for many of us anyway, unless we intentionally create these communities to try to bolster our real life interactions. And I think people are beginning to do that. Plus, I also want to add that there are wonderful communities online. So it's not all, it's not all impoverished. We can make meaningful, intimate, powerful, positive connections online, but it's all of that residual where we're just sort of scrolling and swiping and tapping, and we don't really want to be there anymore, but we can't pull ourselves away. That's that in between piece that we all need to work on.
Yeah, I feel like when it comes to dating, I was probably kind of the in between. I've never used Tinder or any of these dating apps, but as I met my wife 10 years ago, and at the time I remember it was just starting to become popular. And I remember I would go to bars, and I have a lifetime of being rejected by women that I approach at bars, and it's something you do as a guy, right? It's you go once, you get rejected, you go twice, you get rejected, third time, maybe you get the girl's number, you go on a date, great. Rinse, recycle, repeat, and that's just part of. But I remember I would see guys and girls at bars, instead of interacting with the person next to them, because that can be frightening, right? You can get rejected. Someone can say something mean to you. It's not the best feeling, and it takes a little bit of courage. They would all be swiping.
Yeah.
Like they'd be on the phones trying to find someone, but not looking around the room trying to find someone, on the virtual world.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Really, really disturbing, right? And we're all seeing that in different ways in all walks of life. And it's really concerning because the way that we feel really most alive is by having authentic interactions in the moment with our environment, meaning the people, the natural world, challenges that arise, even if it's just like driving our car in traffic, right? That's an interaction that we process and grow from. The problem with the interactions that occur online is that we can, first of all, the matrix is created by other humans. It's not created by nature. Yeah. And we can control those experiences such that we never have to tolerate any real modicum of distress. And without having to tolerate distress, there's really no opportunity for real growth. Yeah. And this is a real problem.
What do you think happens 20 years from now with, I'll focus more on the younger generation that grew up on phones and social media and filters and the metaverse and crypto and, finding, I think I read some of the 50%, probably even more by now, of people that find their significant other, it's through online. What happens when this nonstop 24/7 nonstop streaming content and not even talk about what's happening with the news and journalists and all the disinformation that's online? What happens to them cognitively, but also socially? Are they just going to grow up to not going to be able to interact with people in the real world?
Yeah. See, I don't even think we need to look 20 years ahead. I think we're already there. I think the millennials in particular are the generation that essentially grew up with streaming content and with phones. Phones sort of emerged in the very early 2000s. Yeah. And so they've been around for 20 plus years. I think, again, I don't like to come out as like the doomsday sort of, but clearly I wrote the book because I am really concerned about the dark side of all of this interacting with devices and the internet. And, because it is this constant bombardment of dopamine, essentially, that results from watching YouTube, being on Instagram, tweeting, the likes, the games, whatever it is. I do think that the sequelae or the consequence is increasing sadness, depression, anxiety, insomnia, and addiction. Yeah. And I am seeing that in my practice. And in my practice, I've had the opportunity to actually do an intervention where I say, you know what, I want you to eliminate all screen, all devices for a month. Let's see what happens to your mood, anxiety, sleep. And again and again and again, when my patients are willing to do that experiment, what they discover is that they feel a heck of a lot better after abstaining, which is why I really feel motivated to encourage people to try to abstain for a month and see what it does. Because when they see for themselves how they feel after not engaging 24/7 with this online content, they can then make an informed decision going forward. Like you did, you got off social media. Now you're back on it, but I bet you're back on it in a way that is more conflicted than it was previously.
It's more aware.
More aware. Okay, even better. Right.
I would hope so, at least. But it's also more, I'm trying to create more than I consume.
Good.
So instead of aimlessly scrolling up and down and just getting mad about what that person said and what that person said, I am trying to, just more of a creative outlet and
nice.
And just consuming less, I think.
Right. So that's wonderful, right? So after abstaining and seeing how your life was different and how your psyche felt different, you went back to using, which most people do, and that's fine and good, right? Because that's the world we live in now, right? You have to sort of live in a cave, not to interact online, and that's not what I'm encouraging. But you went back with kind of a conscious awareness of what you didn't want to be doing, and effortful engagement in being more creative and less reactive online. And those are great things.
Yeah. And not to be, I don't like the doom porn that's out there. It is out there. It's very convincing. It's very addictive. There's many, many subreddits that, from Collapse to all these others, that it's almost like, being aware is good, but these people seem to be really into it. Like they want it to happen. They want these prophecies to unfold. And that's, I don't know, it's a very scary thing. But I feel like social media is the only, for lack of a better term, acceptable addiction, right? Because alcohol, cigarettes, drugs, overeating, there's things that we don't condone. Right. I'm not going to give cigarettes to my 12-year-old.
Right. I'm
not going to give alcohol, but I will give them a phone, and I will, maybe limit their social media use and gaming use, but I'm not going to completely, I'm still going to allow it.
And that's probably the right thing, right? Walking that middle path, although it's hard. Yeah. And so I think it's really important with kids to make them aware that social media in moderation and used wisely and used with a sense of good citizenship is okay, is a good thing, potentially in their lives, but that there are all of these other potential problems that they need to be aware of and understand why it could happen, especially thinking about the neuroscience.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's important to talk about it, because alcohol, drug, all those things that it's common sense, right? Most people know I shouldn't do it, or I should do it very little, or it's not really good for me. And with social media, it's everywhere. And our phones, they're everywhere, right? Like my mom would call me sometimes, be like, your dad's been on Instagram for 4 hours, blah, blah, blah. So it's age agnostic. But I believe that if you are a teenager, I couldn't even fathom having a phone when I was a teenager, with the trappings of social media, with just writing stupid things and being on it and scrolling. I don't know if I would be able to handle it if I was a 15-year-old, with a phone.
Yeah, well, thank you for your humility around that, because the truth is some 15-year-olds really cannot handle it. And those kids need more guidance, more guardrails, more monitoring, more structure around how much time and when they can be on, what they can use. Other 15-year-olds can figure it out. They're more mature, or that's not their particular drug of choice, or whatever it is. But you talked about your dad, and I think this is a really important and less discussed topic, is the impact on the elderly. There's not much data on this, but there are growing numbers of older people who are spending enormous amounts of time on Netflix, on YouTube, on Instagram. And this is really concerning too, right? Because they're not moving their bodies.
Mhm.
They're not going to the senior center and, meeting up with other people. So isolation it's already a big problem among the elderly, and now it's potentially an even bigger problem. Yes, it's true that for, people who are like geographically isolated or isolated by virtue of disability, the internet can be a great way to connect, but it's also now, I think, driving people who could connect away from doing that, including older people, even people living like in fancy sort of nursing homes or fancy sort of retirement homes are not really, socializing as much as they used to.
Yeah. And again, to the point of not to be the doom and gloom person, Yuval Noah Harari essentially said that these mechanisms, these algorithms, these people, that the programs, everything is hardwired to get to know you better,
Right.
to know your likes, to know your dislikes, to know what ticks you off, what you're into, what you're not, everything about you. And they do, and because you're willingly, you're inputting that info, they're seeing what you're clicking on. If it's, and that's why this, I think, is so different. But how do we even control that? If they're getting to a point and it's just getting better and better, and the technology is advancing, if they're getting to a point where they just know us so well, and they're essentially hacking our pathways, our mind, our brains, our emotions, everything, how do we even stand a chance?
Yeah, well, so one thing I want to say first is when we talk about the way that the AI algorithms learn us and then proffer things to us that they know we will like, we almost always talk about that through the lens of that's so horrible, and I don't want that to. They can't do that, and they shouldn't do that, and that's disgusting. But the truth is, I have personally experienced that very positively. Like it's meeting up with an old friend who knows you well and say, "Oh, hey, I read this book. I think you would like it because you like this other book." And so I have had the experience where when I'm feeling lonely, and then I'll go on there and like, what is YouTube suggesting for me today? And it feels good. It doesn't. I know exactly what the algorithm is doing. I know why they're doing it, and yet I want it. I invite it. It feels good. It feels like a friend who knows me. And that feels good to be known in that way. So I just wanted to put that in there because we almost never talk about, that piece of it.
No, it's great. Sometimes like I'll get like recommendations for a new snowboard or stuff. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. But it's just like, it's kind of like alcohol, right? Like alcohol, a glass of wine after a long day it's great. It's good for cholesterol. It relaxes you. But 20 glasses isn't good. And I feel like this is the same. It's good because it does give you good recommendations sometimes. But then sometimes you're like, oh, snap, 6 hours passed and I'm still on YouTube. Like what happened? Where did my day go?
Absolutely. And part of the way that it does that, I think, is again, because it feels like a friend. Even when we know it's doing it intentionally to keep us clicking, it doesn't feel that way in the moment. It feels comforting, that we're known. It can feel comforting to be known. But yeah, you're absolutely right, which is why my number one recommendation in Dopamine Nation is to take a considered extended break from technology, whether you do that together with others, whether you do that together as a family on a vacation. Our family just took a tech-free vacation. It was fantastic. It went much better than I thought it would.
Wow.
Which was nice, right? Because I have 4 teenagers and they were initially reluctant to leave their phones behind. But when we got to where we were going and we had no phones, it was like, well, I guess we'll talk to each other. And we had great conversations, and they were extended, interesting conversations. I was glad my kids can still have those conversations with us. So I really encourage people to build these breaks into their lives. Just first of all, as a way to reset reward pathways, but also just as a way to remind ourselves of what it is to be disengaged from this technology and what the upsides are.
Can addiction be used in a positive way? Or maybe it may be categorized differently, but if I take someone like Elon Musk, who reportedly works 16, 18 hours a day, and he's achieved unbelievable things, or someone like Michael Jordan, who would practice longer and harder than anyone else. There are people out there who are obsessed with their craft and they've been able to, achieve incredible feats. and they do all have that obsessive gene about them. Can people channel addictive personality to produce greatness?
Well, it's a great question, and I think it really depends on how you define greatness. In our culture, we define greatness as becoming vastly rich, vastly famous, or just achieving some spectacular accomplishment that distinguishes us from the people around us.
True.
And there have been many cultures, across human history that have defined greatness in very different ways. Just thinking of a contemporary isolated culture that defines greatness in a really different way, you can look at the Amish. The Amish forbid people from taking credit for particular accomplishments. If people start to, invest in some passion or hobby or way of farming and then take pride in that, that's considered contrary to living in alignment with their religious faith. And so that's considered not a good thing. So I think it's good to take a really big step back and look at what is the meta structure, by which we have defined greatness. And in this culture, our heroes are Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, yes, Michael Jordan, people who have separated from the tribe and achieved sort of very individualistic kind of a goal. But that's not really the only way to think about, the good life or what it means to really live well.
But can you channel that what would otherwise be destructive behavior into something good? It doesn't have to be, again, I was just taking them as an example. It can be anything, right? It can be, I don't know, working in the shed and building something, or I don't know, being a hiker, like whatever it is that you're into, but just channeling that energy that would otherwise be destructive into something positive and productive.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's an important point. And it's one of the ways that people with severe addiction to things like drugs and alcohol or pornography actually do get into recovery, is to take that sort of obsessive energy, let's say, and that tenacity and put it into something else. Sometimes that something else is their recovery. Sometimes that something else is something else altogether, like a particular form of exercise or a particular intellectual endeavor. Okay. And of course, that can be life-saving and is much better than drinking yourself to death. No doubt about it. But as I talk about in my book, we have to be wary that we don't then take that to an extreme, because I think ultimately what we're looking for is, again, that level balance, somewhere in the middle, which is going to be a different place for different people. For people who are really, really driven and need an enormous amount of friction in their lives to feel happy, their happy place is going to be maybe a more driven kind of place, more challenges, so that they can feel relaxed. Whereas other people might not need that kind of friction in their lives.
I understand. So you would categorize someone like Elon Musk as unhealthy, like because he says like he works 16 to 18 hours a day. I wouldn't. I don't think I could do that on a regular basis. And someone I know, like just off the top of my head, Dana White, who's the head of the UFC, he's the president, same type of character, works 14, 16 hours a day. And they've both, achieved greatness. They're extremely wealthy, very well liked or disliked, depending who you ask. But yeah, is that not healthy?
So I would never try to diagnose somebody who, wasn't a patient of mine. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't say one thing or another about Elon Musk because I really don't know him. Mm-hmm. I don't know what his subjective experience is, but given my knowledge of human beings and the wide variety of people that I've seen, including very successful, very wealthy people, I think we're all pretty much equally happy or unhappy in our lives. I don't think people who have achieved that kind of wealth and fame are any happier than people who haven't, and often are much unhappier. And again, what is the definition of success? You're right. Many people would look at Elon Musk and say, but I don't know. I mean, he's probably missed out on a lot of things in his life because he hasn't had the time to do them. For sure. Like spend time with family, possibly. So it's always a trade-off.
Yeah. There's no perfection. I guess it's just kind of how you want to live your life, and hopefully you can do that. You can follow the path that you want to lead. I want to ask you a question that's a little weird.
Great. I love weird questions.
Cool. That's right up my alley. I'll tell you why it's weird, because maybe from someone from the US, I've only been here 8 years. So I wasn't born here. So I kind of have the view of someone coming into the country, and I think I've assimilated pretty well. And I grew up on a lot of American TV. So I'm pretty into the culture. Do you see differences in the way excitement, which is dopamine, right, is happening or becoming part of the fabric of society in the US differently from maybe other countries? I'll tell you what I mean. Here, people get excited very quickly about a lot of things. It's like, oh my God, I'm so excited. And all right, we're going to have lunch, right? And I remember coming here, I was just like, wow, they get excited really quickly. You know what I mean? And when you go to Europe, when you go to Israel, when you go to other countries, it's much more flat. There's not this peak in excitement over, otherwise mundane things like, going to a bar or going to a party or a lunch. And because it's a dopamine hit, essentially, I guess are you just seeing differences, if at all? Maybe that's not even something that's been on your radar, but have you seen anything along those lines?
Well,
or do you need me to maybe I don't know if I hope I'm asking the question correctly.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are definite cross-cultural differences when it comes to how we conceptualize pleasure and pain. I'll give you a corollary example. The opioid epidemic was triggered by the overprescribing of prescription opioids for minor and chronic pain conditions here in the United States, leading to several generations of individuals dependent on and or addicted to opioids. And that's because, in part, our culture is that we really shouldn't be experiencing any kind of pain. And if we're experiencing any pain at all, the doctor isn't doing their job. And it's going to set us up for more pain in the future. But in Europe, if you have a minor pain problem, throughout Europe, the doctor's kind of like, well, you'll be all right. Take a couple it'll pass, time will heal. Mm-hmm. And not only are doctors more acculturated to say that, but patients are more acculturated to hear that. So I think you are tapping into something that's real and true around how a culture can orient on the experience of pleasure and pain, and then have a big impact on how the individuals living in that culture experience pleasure and pain. And I wasn't aware of this difference about getting excited about, little things. In a way, it's sort of sweet. It's like, oh,
for sure.
It's like the US. Oh, I guess we're like little babies. You give us any little thing and we're excited. So, it maybe speaks to the newness of our country when you think of the age of, European countries, or, well, Israel's a new country in some ways and a very old country in others, certainly a very old culture. It's interesting to hear your experience of those differences.
Yeah, no, I remember coming over and it was back home. I'd be like, "Oh, you want to grab dinner? All right, cool. Let's meet." And then he'd be like, "I'm so excited about dinner." I would visibly, I would see people get excited about things that I would take for granted. And this isn't a knock, or this isn't anything bad or good. It's just an observation that I made coming into a country and seeing how people interact, what they get excited about. But I did notice excitement would get very high over things that we just kind of don't really pay attention to back home. Or it's not even that we don't pay attention. We just, it's just everyday occurrences. It's just everyday stuff, It's not a big deal.
So here's a question for you then. So what we know from the science is that if you train a rat to know that when they hear a bell, they can go press a lever and get an injection of cocaine, that they will, when they hear the bell, actually have a little spike or increase in dopamine firing in their reward pathway. So just anticipating the reward is a reward in and of itself.
Yeah.
Interestingly, we also know from the same science that right after they have that spike, little mini spike in dopamine when they hear the bell, it's followed by a dopamine deficit state where dopamine levels go not just to baseline, but below baseline. And that's craving, right? And then that motivates the individual to go press the lever, or the rat to press the lever to get cocaine. So, and the other thing that we've discovered is that if you train a rat to know that when they hear a bell, they can press a lever for cocaine, and then you don't deliver the cocaine when they press the lever, there's a huge decrease or a plummeting of dopamine levels far below baseline. So an anticipated reward that is not forthcoming leads to a very sharp dopamine deficit state, which is a state of craving, restlessness, anxiety, irritability. So are you finding that with all these people so excited about small things like lunch, is there a come down when like the lunch turns out to be not all that exciting?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just part of the fabric of American society. You'll see it in college football games. You'll see it in just going to any event. Like I said, again, the mundane lunch, dinner, meeting friends. I don't know. I don't necessarily think that there's the come down, like you said, with the rats, but it's bad. But it's just, I don't know. I haven't like analyzed it too deeply, but it is just something that I've noticed that is visibly different than perhaps Israel, European nations. And,
right. Well, I'll tell you,
other places.
One of the things that is true in the United States is that we do have this very strong notion that if you are a mentally healthy person, you are happy. Right. You are positive, you are excited, you are upbeat. And if you're not feeling that in your life, then you are sick and there's something wrong with you. And I think that's not as pervasive in other cultures. I think there's more room in other cultures to be sort of grumpy or dysphoric or, just not super positive. Like there's room for people to be flatter emotionally or even be kind of chronically disgruntled. There's not a lot of room for that in American culture. If you are like that, people are like, you must be depressed. You need to go see somebody. And people think that about themselves too. It's like, oh, I'm unhappy. There must be something wrong with me. Maybe I need to go see.
And then you start getting medicated and all the bad stuff that comes with that. But even just like small things like smiling on the street. Most places in the world, people don't smile at you. When you pass them, it just doesn't happen. And then here, if people don't smile at you, and not everywhere, obviously in New York, no one smiles at you when you walk down the street. But if you walk around, most places in the US, especially smaller towns, people, they'll give you a little nod, a little smile. And then if they don't, you're like, what's wrong with them?
Yes. Right.
But that doesn't happen anywhere. Like walk around Europe, try to get a smile, try to get a nod. No one cares. No one, no, that doesn't happen.
Yeah. I remember traveling in Germany with our small children, and it was so weird because in the United States, everybody stops to, sort of adore a small child, and nobody stopped in Germany. Nope, don't care.
They just don't. It's just completely different.
Yeah.
All right. So I want to utilize our time the best that I can. I want to talk about a topic that might be a little bit uncomfortable, and I'm assuming this is why most people would rather navigate around this rather than addressing it. But I've heard you talk about it, and again, it's one of those issues that I think is very important. Porn addiction.
Right.
It's more accessible than ever. The content is getting more violent than ever. And it's really become mainstream with OnlyFans and other platforms. I think other than Facebook, maybe Instagram, it's really accessible everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, and even Instagram to an extent. It's kind of like, I don't know, soft porn, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't even need to go on all the hardcore sites because it's really all accessible right there. Can you elaborate maybe a little bit and I don't know, share some stats on what do you think, what percentage of men are addicted to porn? Like, what are you seeing happening with men that are getting addicted to porn? Probably, I'm assuming younger and younger. Yeah.
Well, what I have seen in my practice is growing numbers of men of all ages coming in with very severe porn addictions, using 10, 12, 14 hours a day, developing, physical problems as a result, inability to ejaculate, retrograde ejaculation, pain with ejaculation, very, very depressed, anxious, and even suicidal, and yet unable to stop. And almost always they will say that it's the portability of the phone and the kind of infinite access afforded by the internet today that makes it so difficult for them to get a hold of their addiction. It's very hard to get numbers actually on how many people are addicted to pornography. First of all, some people are addicted and don't know it, but many, many people know that they're addicted and yet would be very reluctant to be forthcoming. There's a lot of shame and stigma about addiction more broadly, but there's even more shame about pornography addiction than with the other addictions, is my impression. It's just so incredibly stigmatizing, especially in a #MeToo culture where men are already struggling with how to navigate, consensual sexual relations with other people. Women too, but especially men. I think that's also driven a large number of men to pornography to avoid the complexity of real life. But really, it's the almost infinite access to these potent images, including real life people, that you can get on the other end of the internet, that can satisfy you or try to satisfy you in myriad ways. And just like with other addictions, people usually start out using pornography for fun or to solve a problem. That problem can range from boredom to insomnia to anxiety, you name it. Over time, if it works, they start using more and more. Then they need more potent forms to get the same effect. So, they maybe had vanilla toast pornography to start with, but that pornography becomes more and more deviant over time in order to overcome the tolerance of repeated use. And ultimately, they find that it's interfering with their lives. They have a double life. They're secretive about it. They're less interested in having sexual relationships with their partners because they've sort of exhausted themselves, on pornography. Interestingly, one of the things that I think people don't appreciate about pornography addiction is that on some level, it's not really about sex. It's about escape. It's about numbing yourself. It's about distracting yourself. It's a coping strategy for uncomfortable emotions. It's a way to forget and disappear for a while. It's just sort of the medium that works for some people. Some people, it's alcohol. Some people, it's cannabis. Some people, that same function is fulfilled by pornography. It's a really tough one.
How does it ruin their lives other than obviously like being addicted, but like how does it extrapolate to not having, intercourse with your significant other? I don't know, taking time away from maybe doing work to watch porn? Like, how does it manifest?
Well, just like any other addiction, over time, people use more and more. So just the sheer amount of time that people spend is an interference. They're not as able to be present for others. Even when they're with others, they're obsessively ruminating on getting back to their pornography because they're in a craving state. And then also tolerance is really, people really don't appreciate the ways in which repeated exposure to pornography and compulsive masturbation means by definition that people will need more potent forms or more of it over time. So then people typically then will escalate to riskier and riskier use, more deviant forms, maybe illegal forms, or maybe then meeting up with people in real life, escorts, prostitutes, more and more orthogonal to their values, more lying about their use, then partners finding out and rupture of those relationships. I mean, it's really can have very devastating consequences.
So for a person like that, is the phone just a no-no? Because I mean, everything on the phone is somehow in some way or another can channel back to porn, right? Even, and it doesn't have to be like porn exactly, but just if I take Instagram, that could be a trigger, right? Just like if if you're an alcoholic and you pass by a bar, that could trigger maybe a memory. It's like, oh, I remember the good old days just sitting at the bar. I could do it with one drink. Similar with, I'm assuming, Instagram, where it's not actual porn, but it's close to, it's adjacent.
Right. Yes. So, I mean, just like with any addiction, the first step is a period of abstinence, minimum 30 days to reset reward pathways. And then it's a process of figuring out, okay, how can I move forward? We typically consider sex to be a part of a healthy life. So then it's a matter of defining, okay, what is healthy sex for me, and what is the kind of sex that I need to avoid. And often for people, that's defined as, sex with my partner, but not sex with myself using pornography or other images. But people define that in all kinds of ways. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then it's a matter of figuring out, all right, how can I change my immediate environment so that I'm not triggered to use? And for some people that will come down to, I just can't be on certain social media apps, or I can't watch certain types of YouTube videos, or I can't listen to certain types of music. Everybody's a little bit different, but knowing what our triggers are is really key.
Why does the pleasure of everything kind of diminish over time, right? Coffee, sex, beer, sugar. It seems like we need, I remember now I drink a glass of 2 glasses of wine and I'm good. I might just go straight to sleep. But in my 20s, I was able to drink probably 3/4 of a bottle of whiskey, and I'd be fine in the morning. I mean, I don't know. You could, I guess, categorize that being an alcoholic. Same with weed. I used to, smoke a lot of weed in my 20s. Started actually in my teens, but again, had to smoke more and more and more to get the same effect, and the effect would actually lessen. So you have to smoke more and more. And the same with alcohol, is just your body just builds, a defense against it, or like, what is the reason? What's the
what's going on?
Yeah, what's going on?
Well, I mean, to understand this, it's important to understand that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and that they actually work like opposite sides of a balance. And one of the overarching rules governing that balance is that it wants to stay level or preserve what neuroscientists call homeostasis. So when we do something pleasurable, we get a little tip to the side of pleasure, the release of dopamine in the reward pathway. But no sooner has that happened than our brain will adapt to that pleasure by downregulating our own dopamine production. And I always imagine that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But they like it on the balance, so they stay on until it's tipped an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain before getting off. So this is the key. The way that the brain restores homeostasis after exposure to an addictive substance or behavior is by tilting first an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain and then going back. But here's the second rule governing this balance. With repeated exposure to the same or similar pleasurable stimuli, that initial response gets weaker and shorter, but that after response to pain gets stronger and longer. In other words, now we get 2 gremlins, 3 gremlins, 10 gremlins. Pretty soon, with chronic heavy exposure, we end up with enough gremlins on the pain side of the balance to fill this whole room. And they're camped out there, right? They've got their tents and barbecues in tow. They're not going anywhere soon. And that's the dopamine deficit state. And that's where we get if we continually ingest highly reinforcing substances and behaviors. And when we get to that state, it's a very complicated state, because now we need to use not to get high, but just to feel normal. And when we're not using, we're walking around experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance: anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving. And importantly, our focus has narrowed. So other things that used to be enjoyable, more modest rewards, they're no longer enjoyable, because when we put those on the pleasure side of our balance, they can't compete with all those gremlins camped out on the pain side. So that's why we need to abstain for long enough for the gremlins to hop off, for our brain to restore baseline tonic dopamine firing, i.e. homeostasis, so that we have a supple balance that can respond to pleasure, can respond to pain, and can readjust itself, through the course of our day as, we're trying to interact with our changing environment.
So really, balance and moderation is the key to everything, because you can, drinking water is extremely healthy, but if you drink, 8 gallons a day, you're probably going to die. And
right.
It's just, everything is moderation. Like, you can enjoy some alcohol, you can maybe even enjoy a cigarette, even though it's not healthy, once in a while. and watch a little bit porn and go into whatever it is that you're doing, right? As long as it's in moderation.
Right. It's an old message that we need to remind ourselves of because we're living in this dopamine overloaded world. But one word of caution, I do have quite a few patients who I'll say, well, do you drink alcohol? They said, oh, only once a week. Well, that sounds like moderation. How about cannabis? Oh, just once a week. Oh, okay. Well, that sounds like mine. How about cocaine? Oh, no, just about once a week. So it turns out that on any
just
given,
a little bit of heroin,
right,
yeah.
right. So that in their minds, it's moderation because it's like just once a week of each drug. But really, every single day they're doing something that is addictive, and there's something called cross addiction. Really, all drugs of abuse, all behaviors that are addictive, all substances that are addictive, work on the same common pathway. They all are mediated via dopamine. So even if it's different drugs, if you're doing something every day, you're essentially a daily user and probably in that sort of addictive loop with your gremlins camped out on the pain side of the balance.
Those damn gremlins.
Exactly.
What if, I don't know if there is one, but if there is, in your experience, is there one addiction that is hardest to beat? Maybe heroin or social media. I have no idea. I'm just, or are they all the same? Addiction is addiction, and it doesn't really matter what the substance is.
Well, you're leading into a very interesting area of discussion, which is the whole idea of drug of choice, which is to say what's reinforcing for one person is not necessarily reinforcing for another. So for me, it's social media, social attachment, love and sex, but alcohol doesn't do anything for me. Cannabis, not interested. Caffeine doesn't wake me up. So it's really a matter of what is the lock and key for a given individual. And for that individual, the hardest thing to overcome is the thing that's the key in their particular lock. Of course, there are some people who are more wired for addiction generally than others and can get addicted to just about anything. But for most of us, there's some kind of specific category of substance that's really our pull. And that's the one that we either have to avoid altogether or be very vigilant about, moderating use.
Anna, thank you so much for your time today. This was very insightful. This was great. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for your great questions and your curiosity.
I know you're not on social media, but where can people find you? What are some good places on the internet?
Well, I'm really generally not on the internet, but there is a website for the book, dopamineNation.com. People can check that out. That has some additional information, and they can listen to your podcast.
Yeah. I'll be sure to link the book in the show notes. Go check it out. It's amazing. Anna, thank you so much again for your time today. I really appreciate it. And maybe we'll do this again in the future.
You are very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Take care.